Hello everybody and welcome to the first episode of Cool Tool Tuesdays here at Purgatory Ironworks. I am your host Trent and we're going to be taking a look at some cool tools today. So one of the amazing things about collecting old tools is the fact that they're such a freaking mystery. Now if you got tools that are late 1800s, early 1900s, it's pretty easy to identify them. If you have a couple of the old catalogs from back in those days, remember you had things like Sears and Roebuck. You know, you had factories pumping out tens of thousands of the same item, and I do stress factory. You have all this reference material. It's pretty easy to identify a tool from that time period because you have paper reference, and when you see an advertisement, it actually tells you what the thing does, right? So when you go back before that, though, that's a problem because you don't have a standardized tool. For example, a hammer. Now, we know what a hammer is, but we know what a hammer looks like because we've seen basically the same hammer 10,000 times because we make millions of them. Before the advent of those factories, you didn't really have that. Each hammer was a slight variation. It was very specific to an industry, so it becomes much more difficult to identify. Plus, you don't have any paper references. You didn't have a Sears and Roebuck catalog in the year 1700. So it becomes very difficult to date some tools because, a human lifespan could be 80 years. So if somebody built something in the Revolutionary War, then by 1860 they still could be using or making the same style tool even though the rest of technology has moved on. So it's a big guessing game. There are very few items that we have that have good documentation with them. So it's a big guessing game. It's a lot like paleontology except with metal bones. So the other thing that makes it very difficult to get good ideas or IDs on these tools is the fact that in the day of the blacksmith, especially if something was metal, understand everything was recycled. It wasn't the fact that you had two bad axes, you just mush them together and make one really good axe. So you see this often with anvils. If you're familiar with Peterite anvils, which are a very common English anvil that are here in the United States, a lot of times the stamp on there says guaranteed best scrap. Well, what would happen is the blacksmith would actually have a pile of scrap metal, usually horseshoes or stuff that he wasn't really going to reuse. Scrap guy would come by, he'd pay him for it, and that is what actually became these anvils. So that's why you see best scrap, because these anvils were literally made from scrap metal. So even though you thought you had a nice antique in your late 1800s Peterite, well guess what? That Peterite is probably made from wrought iron that could have been 100 years older than it was. So it gets to be an amalgam. So one of the greatest examples of seeing stuff that are repurposed and remade, the first recycling so to speak, is going to be something that's known as a wagon axle or buggy axle more specifically. So now there's a whole evolution of buggies and all that kind of stuff, and I won't get into that, but toward the later 1800s the buggy axle, a lighter type of buggy axle, came into being, and I have seen all kinds of tools that have been made out of these axles. It was a long piece of steel and apparently very, very handy for a number of things. So this guy that I have right here, let's take a look. If you can see, this is the buggy axle. You see a spindle right here. You have a square shank. Now this was normally not just there by itself. So what happened here is that this would actually be backed by a wooden piece. So what would end up happening is that you would have this on the bottom and you'd have a shaft of hardwood, and that would end up making your actual buggy axle. But you can see that this one here is clearly worn. If you look at it from the side, it's almost egg-shaped. I mean, this bad boy is just done for. So what do you do with this guy? Well, now it's a, oh, look here. I didn't even see that. There's actually a stamping on here, so this is most likely came out of a factory of some type. I'll have to see what that is. I don't know if you guys can see that, but there's actually a stamp here. But when this got done, what happened is they took this fella, and you can see we have the axle. This is probably about half of the axle, but if you turn around you can see that this guy has actually been made into a pry bar. In fact, a split pry bar. Now, was this particularly used for, let's say, pulling nails? Maybe. I doubt that simply because this interior edge here has not been beveled or angled like a proper nail puller. but you can clearly see it has been split for a reason. If it were just a straight pry bar, they wouldn't have had the split, so I'm going to guess that this was specifically for pulling out some type of nail on that end of it. And again, you can see that the roughness of the cut indicates that it was cut by hand. So here you have this super cool, what would otherwise be a piece of junk, but this is actually a tool that has been repurposed. Now, I don't know if these buggy axles are wrought iron or steel. I've seen a ton of this type of pry bar made from these. So I suspect these are most likely later 1800s and some type of higher carbon steel as opposed to just wrought iron. So this is a cool example of a buggy axle being made into something else. But there's a lot of examples of this, and one of the coolest ones I've ever run across is going to be this one right here. So obviously, if you're a smith, you immediately recognize these as a pair of tongs. Maybe not a really cool pair of tongs or a really nice pair of tongs, because look how clunky these handles are. I mean, they're ginormous. I mean, the front end here is formed very well, very skillfully, but this is just a nightmare. And if you take a closer look though, check this out. You can see, look right here, this is a spindle as well. This is actually another half of a buggy axle. Now this is a little different. This is a very common piece here. You can see that this side is actually half round. This side is flat. I've seen both rectangular and this half round in the different buggies. But it's interesting because there's a lot of questions in here to be answered. But I want to give you a couple of details here that tells me a little bit about the smith. So clearly, when you have these guys here, and you can look at the detail of the pincers there, you can see that they are very well done. They're very smooth. If you look at this side of the rivet, you can see that the rivet is peened very well. And I don't know if this was actually a made rivet or something that they scavenged from somewhere else. In fact, I'm going to say it was scavenged, because if you can see, let's see, right here, I actually see a little bit of squaring. So this is most likely a carriage head bolt that was robbed from somewhere else. And then if you look here, you can see that it was very, very poorly peened over here. So it's very strange in the fact that you've got this very well done front and you got kind of a boogered up rivet. The other thing is that you would think that if you had a competent smith, these handles are just atrocious to hold. Now, what these tongs were for, I'm not really certain. I'm not sure what they were for picking up, but it was clearly would have been a nightmare handling these. It's very rough. The reins aren't drawn out. Normally, if you were in a blacksmith shop and you had a competent smith, they would have pulled these guys out and made them nice. Why they didn't, who knows? Now, here's the thing though. I can say that it wasn't a competent smith. However, you can go out in my shop right now and find a dozen tools that look like dookie simply because I needed them to function at the moment and didn't want to spend a lot of time putting them together. So was that this case? I don't know. But, so being a metalworking smith though, there's a lot of interesting little details we can pick up from something like this. If you know what you're looking for. And you can see telltale marks of a craftsman that's been dead for 100 years. So first thing I want to do is open this guy up, and if you can see right here, there's actually a witness mark. This is a center punch. So what measurement they were looking for, I don't know, but that particular mark is where they center punched it for a measurement. So again, this is part and parcel of how you were to work steel. The other thing here, if you'll notice right here, and let me roll this over just a little bit so you can get a side view here. If you can see that very subtle lap, that's actually a forge weld. So this was actually put together in two different pieces, at least two different pieces. You can see clearly that it's been cut with a blacksmith's chisel right here. So you get to see all of these very cool marks. Now, were these marks originally made when the axle was made, or were they made afterwards when this was made? There's no way to tell. However, what we do have is a super cool functional pair of tongs with just a ton of history in them. Now again, as a blacksmith, who's going to nerd out about a center punch mark? The reason I nerd out about this is because it's analogous to what I do in the shop. When I can go out into the shop and I make that center punch, and I can look back to a piece that's far, far older than I am and say, I know what that man did. I know what he did right. I know what he did wrong. I know what he just got by with. You talk about being able to touch history with your own work, and that's about as close as you can get, folks. So guys, that is Cool Tool Tuesday this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. We got a ton, and I mean a ton of more cool and interesting tools and antiques coming out over the next couple of weeks. I hope you'll come back every Tuesday right here at Purgatory Ironworks. Thank you guys for watching.